This Dreadnought is FDM printed. That's right, no nasty resins, no fancy plastics, just plain old FDM printing. And today I'm going to show you how I got this model printed and onto the tabletop, covering every step of the way so that hopefully you can too. Starting with slicing and printing, moving on to support removal and a little bit of model cleanup, and finally assembling this model and even showing you how I painted it. So, without further ado, let's begin. And as with all 3D printing projects, it all starts with the model. Today I'm going to be using this Enforcer from the Puppetswar STL Library. They kindly supplied me with a ton of their files for a previous video, where I tried to recreate a 40k combat patrol using their models as proxies. Links up here. And ever since then I've been wanting to print off one of their larger models, so this feels like the right choice. After going through the renders and choosing the weapon loadout that I wanted, as well as selecting all of my various parts from the cosmetic options for the model, I landed on the designs that I wanted to use to create my classic walking space coffin. Initially, I started this project in Bamboo Studio, but eventually transitioned over to Orca Slicer, with the intention of printing some of these parts on my A1 and some of them on my Neptune 3 Pro. The idea with swapping to Orca was so that I had the whole project in one place and could just swap my profiles and send a print to either printer. A plan that fell through when my Neptune 3 Pro ended up needing some new parts that still haven't arrived yet. All that to say, you might see the slicer change a couple of times throughout the video, but there's no need for confusion. At the end of the day, all of my files were exported out of Orca Slicer to the A1 for all of the prints. And I much prefer Orca Slicer's tree supports anyway, so win-win. After importing all of the pieces for the Enforcer, I split it up into 5 roughly even build plates. This was so that I could minimize the risk of a print failure causing problems with the whole model if it was a single print, and it let me split up the printing into chunks, allowing me to print 1 or maybe even 2 build plates a day, while I could keep an eye on them. I then took some time to orient and position all of the pieces in a way that would limit overhangs that might end up being visible from the front of the assembled model, as well as limiting where pieces would have shallow angles that would introduce a bunch of layer lines. I also sunk some of the parts into the build plate a little bit. This essentially cuts off the area that is pushed beneath the build plate, and the outline displayed here is now what our first layer will be. Comparing these two, one at the default import height and one pushed less than a millimeter into the plate, it's clear that one of these will have much better contact area and therefore better adhesion to the build plate. And it's not like we're removing enough of the model for it to matter for the final print. For supports, I mostly used the hand-painted manual supports. I did this to avoid any of those nasty blemishes that you get when supports go further than they need to and connect to unnecessary parts of the model, leaving behind a bunch of print scars on the surface. Using the support painting feature, and highlighting the overhangs to better see where the supports were needed, I went about painting in these areas. Then it's just a back and forth process, painting in the supports, slicing the model to check, and refining the painting. It's worth taking your time here. 5 or 10 minutes back and forthing painting in the supports for a model is much better than doing half an hour of cleanup on the final print, or even having to spend hours reprinting because something wasn't supported quite right. If you want to see my full guide for supporting and orienting prints, you can check that out up here and down in the description below. For some of these pieces that just needed a single flat area supported, like these various domed connections, I changed over from the slim tree supports that I'm usually using to the normal grid supports. They're more stable and do a better job at supporting large flat surfaces like these, but otherwise I just kept the settings the same as the tree supports. No need to change anything special here. Regarding my print settings, I used a 0.2mm nozzle for this project, just to get the sharpest corners and cleanest details out of the sculpt for this model. And this was my first proper supported miniature project on the A1, so I used the various prints of this mini to start dialing in my settings. For 1 or 2 of the parts I tried printing at 0.06mm, but that took too long for a model of this size, and it made the slim tree supports more likely to get snapped mid-print. So I ended up going with 0.08mm for the majority of the pieces. And regarding a few of my other settings, such as support Z-top distance, these were simply way off until I got them dialed in right. I'll throw up some screenshots now of the print settings that I landed on during this video, just in case you want to copy them at all. And if you want to know how you can get your hands on direct downloads to some of my various printer profiles, keep an eye out for next week's video. All of that information will be packed in there, along with some other fun goodies and important information. So hit subscribe and feel free to turn on notifications so that you don't miss that when it comes out. But for now, we're back to printing. As you saw before, I had a couple of hiccups as I was dialing my settings in. But by the last couple of build plates, I had these settings tuned in and printing some gorgeous looking pieces, with minimal support scarring and barely visible layer lines on a lot of the flat surfaces. Will we ever get rid of layer lines on FDM prints altogether? No, of course not, but getting this close is amazing. And I reckon these will disappear with just the tiniest bit of sanding, which we might try on some of our larger flat areas later down the line. As you can see, I was very excited by this project, to the point that I was removing supports and playing with the pose as pieces were still coming off the printer. So our little collection of parts here will grow as they're ready. In total, this model took roughly 42 hours to print, give or take a few hours for some of the minor print failures we saw earlier, and it only used about 70 grams of filament. That's with a 0.2mm nozzle at 0.08mm layer heights. That's not bad in terms of print time for FDM, and for a model that looks this good, I'm damn happy with 42 hours. In terms of support removal, most of these come off pretty easily just by lightly pulling on them with a pair of nippers, but in some places they need a bit more persuading to come free. For those areas, I like to use my nippers to pinch the supports just below the interface to almost squeeze them off the model, and then twist them to peel them off the part. It's good to be careful here. Not so much a problem on large models like this, but you can easily ruin a more delicate miniature by being too aggressive with support removal, which really sucks after a long print, so take your time. Once the supports are all removed, my next step is usually a once-over with a hobby knife, using the knife to either nick off those chunks, or to simply flatten out the small surfaces that might not quite be perfect. And that's usually where I leave cleanup for a model. Often I'm printing smaller miniatures, and by this point they're usually ready to paint. But as I mentioned earlier, this model has a bunch of broad and flat surfaces, and with a print this clean, I reckon we can all but eliminate those with just a little bit of sanding. But first, let's assemble the model. There's no point in cleaning up areas that we're not going to be able to see. For most FDM models, I just use simple old superglue. Nothing fancy. For big models like this, I would recommend maybe trying out some gel superglue if you're finding it an annoying assembly process. But otherwise, normal superglue and some patience will do the job. I wanted to go for a sturdy pose with a bit of action to it, almost like our Dreadnought is walking forward while shooting, having to lean into the gun so that the force of its shots doesn't keep it from moving forward. I did struggle a bit with the legs I had chosen. They made it a bit tricky to get that sense of movement, but eventually I landed on a pose that I think looks pretty damn battle ready either way. Today I'm going to be putting this model on my own custom base, that I have digitally sculpted specifically for clean FDM printing, with no supports necessary, and no shallow angles on things like rocks that would introduce a bunch of layer lines. A versatile design made specifically to look great straight from your FDM printer. And same as before, if you want to know how you can get your hands on the files for these bases, as well as future FDM friendly bases, keep an eye out for next week's video. All the details will be in there. Alright, let's revisit that final step of cleaning up this model with just a little bit of sanding. I don't want to spend hours here though. I'm going to do a single, quick pass with some 1000 grit sandpaper. 15 minutes max for the whole model. Just picking out some of those nice big areas that we can easily smooth out. And the only other thing I did was employ a nail file just to clean up those smaller corners around the shoulder pads here, and make sure they were nice and sharp. But, as I said, with just 10 to 15 minutes of sanding on just the large areas, the shoulder pads, the cockpit, and the forearm, as well as a tiny bit on the loin guard and missile launcher, these flat surfaces look great, and I reckon ready for paint. For such a big model like this, usually I would have to rattle can prime, and then go through the rather painful process of applying an all-over base coat by brush. But it just so happens that I have a new toy here in the studio that might make that process way more enjoyable. This is the Swallowtail SD airbrush by Gallery, their newest trigger airbrush. Gallery were kind enough to send this airbrush my way to use in some videos if I ended up liking it, and it made it into the video, so spoilers, I do. Originally, they wanted to send me their Mobius 0.2, which is a more classic dual-action gravity-fed airbrush, but I've always liked the idea of a trigger-action airbrush for longer, more broad painting sessions. And because I tend to use airbrushing mainly for priming, base coating, and varnishing, I figured this would be a better tool for my needs. With options for both gravity or siphon fed, and the ability to swap the feeder to the left or right of the airbrush makes this a very versatile tool, where the cup will never need to get in the way of seeing what you're painting. This kit also came with 2 different needles and caps, the 0.28 for smaller projects like miniatures, but also a 0.5 for if you want to cover larger surfaces fast, which could be great for terrain. After applying a nice even prime through the Swallowtail with Army Painter's matte grey air primer, I rinsed out the airbrush and added in some ultramarine blue. and once again sprayed a nice clean coat over the whole model, being pretty generous with my layers here. This is an FDM print. We don't mind doing some slightly thicker base coats just so that we can fill in any of those last few layer lines. Unfortunately, this ultramarine blue ended up looking quite desaturated and not quite as dark as I had wanted, so I added a little bit of Beowulf blue and some grim black speed paint to what was left in my airbrush cup, and did a light coat to create a much richer shadow colour that I could work up from. I then came in with my midtone or first highlight, once again through the airbrush with a layer of magic blue, just on all of the top facing surfaces and large flat panels, using this colour to bring up the majority of the model to that colour that I wanted, making sure to coat most of the chassis and the armour while leaving the underside and recesses our nice shadow tone. I did end up going a little bit overboard with my midtone here, and blowing out some of those nice shadowed recesses, so I went back to our speed paint mixture, and sprayed very sparingly and deliberately from the underside of the model and into all of the recesses, to bring back some of that darker, more saturated shadow tone. With that done, it was time for one final layer of some more spot highlights through the airbrush before we moved into brushwork. I mixed some bright sapphire into my magic blue, and picked out some of the topmost areas and focal point details, like the cockpit, shoulder pads and missile launcher with this slightly brighter highlight. Compared to all my cheap, crappy airbrushes, the Swallowtail SD has some really nice weight to it that makes it much more comfortable for longer painting sessions. And overall, it just feels like a nice, quality product that gave me some great results, even with my very limited airbrushing experience. If you want to check out any of Gallery's products, or maybe grab one of their airbrushes for yourself, you can use my affiliate link down in the description. And if you are buying from their official web store that's linked below, you can use code PAINTED4COMBAT for an additional 10% off while you're there. Any purchase you make after clicking that link or using the code will generate a small kickback for me, to help support the channel at no extra cost to you. Now that we have such a great base coat to work from, it's time to start adding some detail to this paint job. I started by sponging on some Imperial Navy, to add some weathered texture to some of the corners and panels, before I started edge highlighting with a 2-to-1 mix of bright sapphire to magic blue, hitting all of the edges. This helped to separate all of the sculpted panels and deepen the recesses, making the geometric design of this model really pop. I also added a few little scratches coming off of some of those edges at this stage, to add some more weathering to the model. Then I came in with a spot highlight, hitting some of the most prominent edges and intersecting highlights with some pure, bright sapphire, to really make those corners shine. From there, it was a simple case of hitting all the additional areas with their respective colours. Red for the cockpit lens, though maybe this is actually meant to be a window, who's to say, and the same red on the missiles and gun lens, highlighted with some orange and a dot of white. For all the blacks, I hit those with a base coat of matte black, making sure to get all of the inner machine components to help further separate the chunks of this model and increase the contrast. Then all the outer facing black details got an edge highlight with some deep grey. For the metals, a simple base coat of silver was shaded with a dark wash, then highlighted back up in some of those larger areas with that same initial silver that I used for the base coat. For the base, I coated all of the dirt details with a layer of fur brown. I like this almost desaturated red earth colour against the nice blue armour, as it gives a good bit of contrast in colour. Then I hit all of the tiles with deep grey. This looks a bit confusing and muddy at the moment, but by picking out some of those tiles with ash grey, we start to get some nice difference in colour. A layer of strong tone was then added all over the dirt to shade the recesses, as well as picking out some of those tiles to add some further difference to the colour, as well as a thin dark wash on a few of the other tiles, effectively giving us 4 slightly different colours within this tile pattern. After that, a dry brush of ash grey will help to unify these different tiles a little bit and make them look a bit less jarring. And a final dry brush of fur brown will bring us back to that nice red earth look. By bringing some of that onto the tiles, we start to get a sense of an abandoned city street, war-torn by the battle that our mech is taking part in. And to further ground our mech here and make him feel like he's in this environment, I'll add some of that same dry brushing to the feet of the Dreadnought. And now, after a little bit of superglue and some well-placed grass tufts, our Dreadnought is complete. Now, I'm super stoked with how this model came out. It's easily one of my best paint jobs that you've seen here on the channel, and the fact that it's an FDM print is even crazier. Just goes to show that no matter what your opinions are on smaller FDM miniatures, that bigger models like this, dreadnoughts and vehicles, are definitely projects that can be done on FDM machines. Let me know down below what larger miniature project you'd like to see me do next. I'd be totally keen to tackle a 40k tank, or maybe even a more complete breakdown of printing and painting a dragon, for something like D&D. So let me know down below if either of those projects are something you want to see, or maybe you have a different suggestion. Once again, thank you so much to Gallery for sending out the Swallowtail SD airbrush that I used to get this model painted. And again, those links are down below, and don't forget to use code PAINTED4COMBAT for an additional 10% off your purchase. Like if you liked, and subscribe to stay up to date with my hobby projects here on the channel. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching. And as always, have a good one.